Good evening. Our guest tonight is Baroness Caroline Cox. Of course, you do not require introduction because Armenian community knows you quite well. You're a staunch supporter of Armenian cause and, of course, staunch supporter of the movement in Nagorno-Karabakh and Nagorno-Karabakh struggle. Thank you so much for coming to this interview. I want to begin our conversation by asking you, how did you get involved in a Karabakh question in the Karabakh movement?
It was way back in May 1991 in Moscow, and I was asked by Baroness Sakharov to help to organize a conference, a human rights conference in Moscow at that time. And I was chairing one of the sessions, and one of the members of my group was someone well known, I think, to everybody, Azori Balayan. And he spoke with passion and conviction, as he always does. And he said, well, all of you people here in Moscow are talking about human rights. My people there in Karabakh are suffering them. And of course, Azerbaijan had just begun Operation Ring, the systematic deportation of Armenian villages from Karabakh. 12 had already suffered deportation. And we were so moved by his presentation to our working group. I reported this back to the plenary session and was asked to lead a delegation of international human rights observers down to Armenia to meet the deportees. And we went to Goris, where many of them had been put into a camp, having been driven out of their villages.
I think it's fair to say that this subject carries a rather personal tone to you, because you've been there at the heights of the war in some of the most horrific conditions. You've been present, you've been with people, and you've seen what they've gone through. Can you share us a story that would, in your opinion, define a character of people from Nagorno-Karabakh that you witnessed yourself?
Well, there was the phenomenal courage, there was the phenomenal generosity, and there was the phenomenal faith of your people, and there are just so many, many stories. But I think one, which perhaps is one of the most appalling, was the village of Marahar in Mardaket region. And we heard in Spanicat there'd been a massacre that morning. This was way back in '92, and we immediately went to get the evidence. And Azerbaijan had started shelling at dawn, and then the tanks came and the infantry came, and while they were there, they sawed off the heads of some of your Armenian villagers, and I saw the semicircular saws that they used to carry out that barbaric act. And then there were the burnt corpses and the smoking, smouldering homes. And I remember talking to one of the ladies who had escaped and come back, and it was heartbreak land. The ladies were sort of rummaging through the smouldering ruins of their homes looking for photographs of loved ones they'd lost. And she described how that day she had lost her 4 sons who tried to defend the village with hunting rifles against tanks. They'd all been killed. She lost her daughter-in-law. Her daughter-in-law, and she was now having to faced with the prospect of bringing up the grandchildren. And she said, I just didn't know what to do. We didn't lose all our families, just our families. We lost them. We also lost all our cows. I'm going to have no milk to give my grandchildren. And that scene of utter desolation, the corpses, the burned homes, the bereaved families, the grandparents having to bring up grandchildren because their children are being killed, and no food left. It was perhaps the extreme end of the spectrum of human suffering, of man-made human suffering and man-made barbarity.
Listening to you and, of course, reading a lot of news reports, it took tremendous amount of sacrifice and heroism to come to the point where we are now. We can say that for the past 20 years, Nagorno-Karabakh has at least kept its autonomy. But unfortunately, even though economically it's progressed and politically it's progressed, the status quo remains. It's still unclear what the fate of the conflict will be. In your opinion, politically, where do we stand today?
Well, I think one must give credit to the Minsk group that the continued talks and negotiations have at least stopped the fighting from recommencing. And Azerbaijan, of course, keeps its very aggressive propaganda. We also know Azerbaijan has increased its military arsenal 20-fold in the last 7 years, and it's keep threatening more war. The Minsk group has stopped, at least to date, further serious fighting, and I think that is something to be grateful for. I think the Madrid principles, which are agreed and which Armenia has agreed to, and was the Armenians of Karabakh, Azerbaijan, of course, reneges on all the agreements. So at the moment, I think it is a very uncertain situation, and that is deeply worrying for everybody concerned. But for me, the bottom line is that the Armenians of Karabakh actually deserve far more than anything that's been offered to them. International conventions rule that if peoples are threatened with or suffer attempted genocide or attempted ethnic cleansing, they should have the right to exercise self-determination. The Armenians of Karabakh manifestly suffered attempted genocide, attempted ethnic cleansing. I mean, president after president talked about the eradication of the Armenians from Karabakh. A.N.C.A said a way back, if there was a single Armenian still living in Karabakh, by June of next year, the people of Azerbaijan can take me and hang me in the central square in Baku. It's a pretty formidable statement of ethnic cleansing. So, by international conventions, the Armenians of Karabakh have a right to self-determination. Of course, they had their vote. They had a massive, overwhelming mandate for independence, and I think that is the bottom line, and they should be entitled to that. I don't think they can ever again accept Azeri sovereignty.
Yeah. Just to further elaborate at the bottom line that you mentioned, of course, in my opinion at least, at this point it's out of any questions for Nagorno-Karabakh to reunite with or return to Azerbaijan, especially considering the recent events when the convicted murderer was returned to Azerbaijan and it was hailed as a hero. This in itself indicates the intention of Azeri government towards Nagorno-Karabakh. Having said that, today we have a self-governed regime that is striving to be recognized by international community. In your opinion, do they meet the standard of a democratic country, so to speak?
I'm delighted to say that everything I've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh fully meets the criteria of a country that's doing everything to move towards civil society, democratic government. I was attending one of their elections a little way back, and certainly it met all the criteria of full and free and fair elections. They have their new beautiful assembly building, they have free press, and they have freedom of speech, they have an opposition, and I think they are far more democratic than many, many countries around the world who are recognized as democracies, and I think they are doing everything they can in the inevitably very difficult stage of transition, two times of transition from one very totalitarian kind of political system to a democratic political system, but also a transition from conflict to a post-conflict situation. And I think they're doing amazingly well for a small people in a landlocked land with a devastated infrastructure, but enormous spirit. And I always say about the Armenians, I will say it tonight, that the spirit of Armenians are not only survivors, but you create beauty from the ashes of destruction. And the Armenians in Karabakh, and indeed the Armenians in Armenia, I mean, are proving the strength of that spirit in these amazing years.
It's wonderful you said that, because I believe several thousands of history testify to your point here. I'm curious about your opinion about singular issue. When the conflict began, the main purpose of Nagorno-Karabakh was to reunite with Armenia. That purpose have shifted with time for political reasons. Now it's a status quo. In your opinion, do you think Nagorno-Karabakh should push for independent recognition as a sovereign country, or do you think the prospect of rejoining Armenia is more plausible and they should follow that path?
Well, it's not for me to speak for the people of Karabakh, and I would never interfere in other people's affairs and their delicate, sensitive affairs, so I would leave that to the Armenians of Karabakh to answer. All I will say is that I was absolutely delighted when New South Wales in Australia recognised the independence of Karabakh. I hope that will be the first of a lot of examples of recognition of the independence of the people of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, if that is their ultimately desired solution.
And since, from your standpoint, in terms of the political climate, what do you think Armenian diaspora, particularly diaspora here in the United States and in other developing countries, should do both politically and economically to help Nagorno-Karabakh stand its feet and eventually achieve a recognition?
Well, I think the Armenian diaspora is doing so much already, and I would like to commend the diaspora passionately for all that you do, both in terms of advocacy and attempting to influence the political environment, and also, of course, in aid the rebuilding of the shattered land of Karabakh, and of course Armenia itself following the earthquake, still with that blockade in place. The diaspora has done a phenomenal amount to maintain your motherland, and as Karabakh is part of that historic motherland. On the advocacy side, I'm always, of course, respectful of the fact that the Armenian diaspora places genocide recognition as a priority that I can understand. I've spoken about that in the British Parliament, and it's something that I would fight for with everything that I have, because it's immensely important for justice and also for the international community. One genocide condoned is one too many, and is an encouragement for other potential genocide perpetrators to think they can get away with it with impunity. But I would like to see the diaspora be equally passionate about the political situation of Karabakh. Genocide has happened, recognition is ultimately important, but Karabakh is your future. And sometimes I feel the diaspora, particularly the further away you get from Karabakh, sometimes they are not quite as passionate, they're not quite as thinking strategically about the future of Karabakh as about the genocide. And so I would just put in a plea to the diaspora: Karabakh is your future. Lives, as you know, and many Armenian families are given their own family members' lives as well as the Armenians of Karabakh. It is, I think, a very, well, it's a blood-soaked land with the blood of Armenian people. And I think to fail to fight as strongly in peace for the future of Karabakh as Armenians fought in war would actually be a betrayal of the blood that has been shed.
And just a few words, you mentioned genocide. Of course, we're approaching a 100-year anniversary, rather grim milestone. Are you optimistic that it will be recognized, particularly by the United States and ultimately by Turkey?
Well, one has to remain optimistic. If you give up hope, then you give up fighting. So, of course, one hopes. I'm happy to say that in the United Kingdom, you know, a tiny little land, it's probably smaller than one of your great states in the United States, but the little United Kingdom, one part of our United Kingdom, Wales, has recognised the genocide, and I'm very pleased that there is a memorial to the genocide in Cardiff, in Wales. So it's growing in the United Kingdom, and of course there are many other parts of the world, as you know, which do recognise the genocide. Ultimately, I think more people do recognise it, and ultimately, well, historical truth must surface.
And my final question, you obviously work with your organization HEART, if I'm being correct. Can you please tell us in a few words what are your current activities and what are your plans? Of course, you're a staunch supporter of human rights and human dignity around the world, and the world they recognize. What are your plans? What are you working right now?
Well, in HEART we work for victims of oppression and persecution who are largely off the radar screen of major aid organisations and the political arena and the media. And of course, Karabakh still comes very much in that category. The United Nations still won't go into Karabakh. Shame on the United Nations, I say. British ambassador still won't go to Karabakh, and I feel sorry for the British ambassador. Misses a great experience. We do work in other countries. We work at the moment in Burma with people trapped behind closed borders in Burma, people suffering so much in Sudan and South Sudan, in northern Nigeria, many countries. But Karabakh, of course, remains very much one of our priorities. And I'm happy to say we have a hero of the peace in Karabakh. We always ask local people their priorities. And when the ceasefire was signed in Karabakh, we asked the authorities, your priority now for aid, move from emergency medical aid. They said rehabilitation. The Soviet Union doesn't have much of a concept of rehabilitation. People with disabilities tend to be segregated, kept at home, and not given the quality of life that they could and should have. So Vardan Tadevosian, our hero in Stepanakert, has turned a bombed-out old building into an incredible centre of excellence. People come from all over the world to see what you can do for people with disabilities. They have a wonderful therapeutic repertoire. Of course, there's tissue repair and physiotherapy and psychotherapy and speech therapy, but there's amazing art, music, sport. It's a hydrotherapy pool. And what is brilliant is Vardan is actually spreading this concept of what you can do for people with disabilities throughout the South Caucasus. He goes to where they come from, Georgia, Ossetia, Abkhazia, even some came from Chechnya, to learn what you can do for people with disabilities, to give them a good quality of life. And so that little bombed-out old land of Karabakh, this bombed-out old building, now shines like a light on the mountain in a very dark part of the world, spreading hope and healing far beyond the land of Karabakh. And that's the spirit of Armenia for you.
Yes, yes, indeed it is. And it's quite remarkable considering all the difficulties that went through, and the war was just recently, the progress that this place made. And there are many people that contribute on many levels, from art to politics to different fields. My final question to you, 10 years from now, where do you see Nagorno-Karabakh?
I would love to see the political status in Nagorno-Karabakh, what the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh wish to see for themselves. And that, I think, would make me one of the happiest days of my life if I saw that achieved. I'd like to see the rebuilding of Karabakh, so much beauty already restored from the ashes, so much new beauty appearing. I'd love to see, obviously, the progress towards civil society and democracy continuing and internationally recognized. I'd love to see the rehabilitation center continuing to take hope and healing to people with disabilities, and I'd love to see a smile on the face of every child in Karabakh.
Thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you very much indeed, letting me share some of the pain and the passion and the privilege of making a little bit of a difference.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you.